Welcome to the Calm Cockpit.
In today's episode, we're talking about one of our most neglected tools that is proven to enhance performance and well-being, sleep. We'll break down the most common myths, share the latest science about how sleep works, and discuss how we aviators can use this to our advantage. And of course, we'll share strategies you can start using today to improve your sleep and enhance your flying life.
If, like me, you've ever felt tired all day or struggled to sleep, this episode is for you. Calm Cockpit.
Onyx 1 2 Mike Oscar, runway 27, cover
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Gita Brown, a midlife student pilot and licensed yoga and meditation educator with over 30 years of experience teaching high performers how to improve their lives without adding stress.
And I'm John Niehaus, professional corporate pilot and flight instructor. I've been flight instructing for right about 15 years and recently retired last year from the National Association of Flight Instructors as their program director.
All right, pilots, let's get real. Are you getting regular sleep? Are you one of those 4 to 6 hour people every night? Are you getting that solid 8? Yes. No, yes. So we are going to dive really deep into this topic today. But before we start, I thought it would be helpful to give you a rough show outline so you know what to expect and how long we're going to spend on each topic. First, we're going to do a really brief overview of the difference between short-term sleep disruption versus that long-term sleep disruption. Think that's short-term sleep disruption like that overnight flight you have to do versus that long-term chronic not getting the rest your body needs. And then really importantly, we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the latest research on this topic, about the state of sleep overall in the Western industrialized world, and more specifically, how it really affects our flying skills. Because I think research and knowledge helps to empower the decisions that we make throughout the day of how we prioritize or don't prioritize sleep. Then next, we're going to talk about, of course, specific strategies, how to use all this science to our advantage with a global sort of mindset tip, and then all of the best specific strategies that I've ever used with myself, with my students, and that the research bears out shows that we can use during the daytime, during the evening, and at bedtime to start improving our sleep. So, John, you said you fall into that 4 to 6 category. I cannot wait to dive into this because, it's going to get real. But you have a trip coming up that is really more indicative of that sort of short-term disruption that pilots have. Tell us a little bit about that so we can talk about the difference between short-term disruption and that long-term sleep restriction that most people live under.
Well, I guess the first point is what do you call it when you have the short-term and long-term disruption at the same time? Because really, I think that's where myself and probably a lot of America falls in, is we just don't sleep and then sleep less when we need to.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a chronic problem just across the nation. And certainly I think pilots are no different, even if we might even have more of those issues than other professions. As far as this flight coming up, I think the point to make, and this is a bit tongue in cheek, but all of these issues can be solved with just more coffee, right?
I totally agree that more coffee is a winning strategy for life. So there we go. We solved it. Podcast over. You heard it here first.
Anyways, yes, I do have a flight that is coming up, and I can't talk too much about the details, just the nature of being a corporate aviator. However, I can say that it is roughly a 9.5-hour flight, and it starts in the evening. So we fly through the night so that our passengers can get off the aircraft wherever it is that they're going and start their day. So they get to sleep all the way down, get fresh as a daisy, and then go straight into meetings when we land where we're going. And the pilots and the crew we are tasked with making sure that they get there safely. And unfortunately, in some cases, that means, well, we pull an all-nighter. And luckily for us, it doesn't happen all that often. And the difficulty of it depends on where you go, because sometimes you traverse different time zones and you end up with a little bit of that sunrise that wakes you up in the morning, even though you've been out all night. And in other cases, you traverse the same time zone and you stay in the darkness the whole way. And certainly those are a little bit more complicated and tough on the body. So yeah, in my case, I have one of these coming up. It will have already happened by the time this episode is released, and I will be more tired than I already am. So yeah, we've got a lot to talk about.
I mean, that's a perfect example of a short-term sleep disruption, which happens all the time in piloting life. And on the face, it seems like, well, we should just do nothing but give strategy after strategy for how to mitigate that. You know, like what to do when you arrive at your destination. What are the hacks, right? That's always the latest thing. What's the hack you can do to make that sleep disruption just go away? But what I think would be more useful and honestly more realistic, and the research bears out that this works to offer today, is to look at the issue from a wider perspective, that sort of chronic sleep deficit that you were talking about. And I found for myself, and then also for my students, when they address the more global issues around sleep, then when they have these sort of acute or, momentary lapses where, like you said, you have to fly through the night or something, they already know the best strategies that work for them. They know what works, what doesn't work, and they've tied it to sort of a higher purpose goal, and it becomes easier to manage. It's not that they have to change their life to get 8 hours, otherwise they're doomed. It's more that they change their mindset and their strategies of what they do over the long stretches of time. So in those short disruptions happen, they're able to handle it better. So that's why we're going to spend a little more time on this sort of chronic long-term view. So John, I'd love for you to read this. It's a couple paragraph quote from this neuroscientist, Matthew Walker. He's done amazing research. He's out at University of California, Berkeley. And he's the founder and director of their Center for Human Sleep Science. And he has just some amazing research on this topic. We're going to link all of this in the show notes. So if you're like me, research nerd, and you want to go chase the links and actually see the data, it'll all be there for you. But John, can you share this little one about how the sleep has changed since the 40s to now?
Yeah, he said he believes that sleep deficit is the greatest public health challenge that we face in the 21st century. From a recent article that he published in the National Public Radio interview, Dr. Walker said in 1942, the average American adult was sleeping about 7.9 hours. A recent study shows that they are now sleeping about 6.5-ish hours. And it took Mother Nature 3.6 million years to put this thing called 8 hours of sleep for human beings in place, Walker says. And then we come along and we cut off about 25% of what we needed. And that happened within just a space of about 80 years. That trend has had a serious effect on our health. Deadly diseases, obesity, and suicide rates all have a connection with how much sleep we're getting. Human beings are the only species that deliberately deprives themselves of sleep for no apparent gain. He says that many people walk through their lives in an underslept state, not realizing it. I think I agree with all of what he said. However, I think a lot more of us realize it than maybe he's giving us credit for. We're just maybe not smart enough to do anything about it.
Like we know better, but we're not doing better. We know we should do that, but we don't do it.
Right.
And that's why I think it's important that we have this conversation, because very often they say, oh, what is that phrase? Is it Ben Franklin that said common sense isn't so common? I think that's the phrase. I might be misattributing it. But we do know. But actually, when I start to dig into my students a little bit and actually ask them more specifically beyond knowing just like, it's bad that I don't do that, do they actually know how sleep works? When I tell them that what happens, like little factoids, like your brain shrinks when you sleep so that the fluid can wash over it and remove the byproducts of the toxins that have accumulated through the day. They're like, what? My brain shrinks when I sleep. They get like more motivated and energized to change their behavior instead of that like finger wagging. you should be sleeping more, which just feels like to me like oppressive. And then I want to fight against it and stay up late, like a little kid being like, I would stay up late. So I don't know. I think there's like a psychological turn between knowing it's good for you and really understanding and being invested in why. And that's why I really love this quote from Dr. Walker. And you're going to see there's a few more sprinkled throughout the episode because I feel like he makes it very approachable in a way that's bridging the scientific article with an actual strategy that's useful for the individual. But this whole idea, when I look at it, that in 80 years, which is like my mom's lifespan, we went from 8 hours to 6.5 hours with no perceived benefit. That's kind of a head scratcher. And it's led the World Health Organization to declare that there is a sleep deficiency epidemic in industrialized countries. Wow. And we kind of just don't do anything about it. We just kind of ignore it, which I find fascinating. I think there's like a resistance, which we can dig into a little bit as we go on. Let me give this other quote. Then I have a question for you, John, on why you think we're so resistant to taking this information on and changing. So another quote from our doc of the day, Dr. Walker. Probably the most dramatic thing that most people underappreciate the impact that a lack of sleep has on both the brain and body. So this simple statement is that most people on the street do not know this. The shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. Short sleep predicts or causes mortality. Dun, dun, dun. The second thing that most people underappreciate or don't know is that every major disease that is killing us in the developed world now has significant and causal links to a lack of sleep. The list currently includes Alzheimer's disease, depression, dementia, and suicide, as well as cancer, diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, stroke in both brain and body, and also hypertension. Can you imagine what the world, end quote by Dr. Walker, can you imagine what the world would look like if we were teaching this to our children in, not necessarily in grade school, but in high school, to understand that the shorter your sleep, the shorter your mortality? And I'm thinking particularly for pilots, cardiovascular disease, stroke in both brain and body. I know for me as a single pilot, as a potential single pilot out there on my own, I want to lower my risk of having a cardiovascular event or a stroke when I'm out there on my own as much as I can.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you, so the implications for the pilots are huge, but John, why do you think we know better, but we don't do better? Where's that friction? Is it like a work ethic kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that, there's a lot of other really good quotes out there that reference time, right? And it's our most valuable resource. And, of course, it's funny because you talk about time as a valuable resource, and then you realize that by overutilizing your time, as Dr. Walker just said, you are actually shortening it. So it's weird. On one side, you're trying to get more of it. On the other side, you're losing it. But I think as human beings, our perspective only truly goes about as far as our noses can. And, what happens in 25, 30, 40, 50 years, well, that's tomorrow's problem, right? But today I've got an extra report I got to do. Today I've got to beat another level on that video game I've been playing. I got to read another chapter in my book. I have to do this thing now, and consequences be darned for what happens next, because it's not in my perspective at the moment. Before we go too far, I do think it's important that we say that this episode, I think, actually goes really well with our episode 2, if you haven't listened to it, because that just kind of starts the conversation on sort of that acute sleep loss. We talk a little bit about it around the world flight that I did. And so I think we started that discussion way back then. And I think that these two will pair very well together. So just a little plug for us. If you haven't listened to that episode, please go back and find
it's
episode 2.
A light podcast pairing, this episode
Right.
and episode 2. I think this is so interesting what you were saying, though, about we only see as far as our noses go. And I think perhaps it's an advantage that I have of being midlife and having my father pass, who is almost 100 years old. My mom is in her 90s now, that I'm seeing that other end of the spectrum much more closely than I ever did when I was in my 20s. I also think that along with that, we don't see past our noses. We also think, and I see this in myself, that we say, oh, that's not going to happen to me. Not me. That happens to other people. I have all these other things that I do well, which are going to mitigate the negative behaviors I do. Because I think we sort of need to live in denial. Otherwise, it'd be impossible to get out of bed in the morning. Like,
right.
There's a lot of challenges in the fact that we were born to die. That's like a heavy load to take as a human. And so there has to be a certain level of healthy denial to that. So sometimes it can be taken a little bit too far. So this, I think, for pilots really ties to that phrase that they, I think, began with, was it the shuttle disaster that happened with the normalization of deviance? And I see this with sleep restriction because it takes it out of being normal and every day and just what you do and shows that it's not particularly healthy or useful. I have seen a huge change in my students' attitudes from when I started teaching, I guess that was 30 years ago now, to present day, particularly with high schoolers. But I've really seen a change from them having a lot more downtime, with time just off, just to hang out with friends, just unstructured free time. And I see a huge change in the amount of sleep that the high schoolers are getting. It went from just a very normal, they were tended to sleep more because as teenagers, the research bears out they need to sleep later in the morning and they need to sleep more, to now they're sleeping less and less and less. And I asked a high schooler the other day, who is a second in her class, so she's the salutatorian. And she said, oh, I only got, like 4 hours of sleep last night and I'm so out of it. Blah, 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 blah. And she said, but our valedictorian only gets 4 hours of sleep every single night and she's fine and she does awesome. So I don't know why I can't handle it. And I was like, oh. So I said, okay, do me a favor. You're friends with her. Ask her why and how she's actually doing. Sometime ask her. She said, hey, I came back and I asked the valedictorian about how she only sleeps 4 hours a night and she still has all of her stuff together and she's amazing. And she said, well, that's what my parents do. One's a lawyer, one's a doctor. And my parents don't ever sleep. So that's what I do. And then a few weeks later, same student came back and said, okay, valedictorian came up to me and said she hit a wall and she's starting to sleep more because she can't handle it anymore. And I was like, awesome. I watched this whole cycle, over 2 months, take place. My point is that we've normalized this in society, that if we are prioritizing sleep, it's almost like we have to keep it under wraps. I don't know. Have you seen any things like that in the pilot community? I'm referencing, high schoolers here. Do you see this in your fellow pilots? Like that braggadocious, I don't need that much sleep. I'm good.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm probably one of them. I'll first say I was no valedictorian, but I always reserved at least 2 hours of sleep in school to catch up. So, there's
that works.
No wonder I don't know chemistry because I think I slept through most of it. But I think, it's important to say that when it comes to some of the sleep deprivation stuff as pilots, it is part of the job. I think that again, in the so often comparison between us and doctors, it's just one of those things you go into knowing that it's a obstacle or a challenge that you will have to figure out how to deal with. And that's just part of the game. So I think it's important to note that this conversation isn't about complaining. It's about going, okay, we know that this is a known issue or a known risk. How do we make ourselves better? Now, back to your original question. Yeah, it's absolutely one of those situations where nobody wants to admit weakness. I think that, you can call it any of the normal terms, whether it's a macho attitude, whether it's a, can-do attitude or whatever. I think that there are certain times where you're sitting there going, I've been awake for 22, 23 hours and I still have a landing to do. And if I'm not good, does it matter? Somebody's got to do it. I do think that stems from an honest discussion where if you can have a pilot who's been more rested or who feels better than the others, I think that that's an important thing to do, and certainly making the appropriate decisions so that the flight continues and ends in the safest way possible. And I think that that's something that happens now more than it ever did. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think ultimately in our society, and of course as pilots, we don't always want to admit weakness because we want to be able to complete the mission the way it's supposed to be done.
Yes, and that is partly why I was making some of my points, because it's like if we lack that self-awareness, that's really a dangerous attitude, a sort of across the board for humans in general. So instead of looking at that as a weakness, that you understand what you need and can communicate it, I'd like to change that even more so, as you were saying, into a strength in the pilot community, that you know what we need and we know where our limits are. So I think we can now shift to sort of our next little section of the podcast, which is looking at 3 specific studies and looking at areas of how sleep restriction affects memory and safety. And just again, as you were saying, to go over these as little bullets so that we really have more clarity on understanding, well, yes, the negative things that can happen with sleep deprivation, but then also turning that into, quite honestly, a superpower, because we can then easily extrapolate that if we change our behaviors, then we're moving away from these more negative outcomes. So looking at how sleep restriction affects memory, maybe I'm concerned about this because I'm currently studying for my FAA written exam, the first one I've ever taken. And so John and I were chatting before the show. He's got a recurrent coming up, and I'm studying for this exam. There's a lot to memorize. So this study was done. Again, I'll link these all in the show notes so you can do the deep dive and read the whole thing if you want. But basically, the study was looking at the hypothesis: is pulling an all-nighter a good idea for studying specifically for memory retention? So they had 2 groups, the sleep group and then the other group that they made stay awake. And yes, they watched them and made sure they didn't sleep. It was under a lab in full supervision. Then they put them in an MRI scanner the next day. Here's what they found out. The people who had a full night of sleep, they saw lots of, quote, healthy learning-related activity. Yet, in the people who were sleep deprived, we actually couldn't find any significant signal on the MRI whatsoever. They go on to say, the researchers, it's almost as though sleep deprivation had shut down the memory inbox. Any new incoming files, they were just bounced. What sleep does is it takes those new memories and it starts to integrate them and associate them with your past back catalog of autobiographical memories. And this deep dreaming sleep that we cycle in and out of during a long 8 hours of sleep does this by interconnecting the facts you just brought in, and it integrates them with what you knew before. And that's what takes us from knowledge to wisdom. And that really kind of hit me in the head as an educator of sometimes why I think when we know these things are good for us, but we don't act on it, is that we haven't integrated the information into wisdom, which then allows us to turn it into action. There's a big difference between knowing a fact, sort of just a light fact, and truly integrating it with all of your life experience and then being able to act on it. And isn't that so cool that if we sleep more and are more cozy and have more time in bed that feels so good and relaxing, we're actually making ourselves more wise without working? It feels amazing. I don't know. Am I just lazy? I'm just I would love to be smarter without working harder. But I think it speaks to that paradox we were saying. No one wants to show weakness. We certainly don't want to show what we don't know. But the good news is that if we sleep more, we're actually literally going to be wiser and more capable, which to me feels like a huge relief. And imagine if we were teaching our valedictorians, our salutatorians, our future pilots that if you truly want to be that go-to resource crew member on the all-night flight and you're going to handle the landing because you're coming into it fully not sleep deprived, right? Full of that good sleep that you've had in the weeks leading up to it, you have a much greater chance of using that wisdom because your memories have all been integrated. Flying while under sleep restriction. I just want to give this little point here because this one, I think it falls into a little bit of that serious category, but I think underscores the need to take personal responsibility for things. So this was a published paper in the journal Healthcare. And they did a meta-analysis of sleep studies. And there was one that really stuck out to me. So this was one where they had people who were sleep deprived and they used a driving simulator, which I thought was what a brilliant idea. So they compared 4 groups. I'm going to narrow down the research here and just give us the 2 that are relevant to us. They had a group that had that 8 hours of sleep, and then they had a group that had the 4 hours of sleep. So those who slept for the 8 hours, guess what? They drove fine. They didn't drive off-road. They were good. The subjects who slept 4 hours, And those in the other group who were legally drunk had a comparable level of errors. So this is to say again, they had a group that slept for 4 hours, and they took another group and got them drunk, and they drove the same. That makes me like, oh my gosh, that makes me rethink so many driving things I've done in my life. So, but again, what does that mean for pilots? Because there's going to be times where we have to operate under these conditions. So, but I think it's important to know, like, I think that's the level of severity. And I don't really think that people actually know that. Is that surprising to you, John? Or does that just seem like, oh, yeah?
I think that it's something that you see all the time, but maybe not quantify. So it's observations that you have and you go, oh, okay, that's weird. But then when you hear it laid out right in front of you saying it's equivalent to alcohol use, all of a sudden it hits a little bit different, doesn't it? And, I think the story has already come up in a previous episode, but I remember one of the times when I was flying charter and I was doing a lot of legs, and it was at all different times during the day and long days. And long story short, the last leg, I specifically asked my co-pilot if I could just run the radios and swing the gear, because I just was not feeling, I wasn't fatigued from a legal standpoint where I didn't feel like I was unsafe for the flight, but I also didn't feel like I was 100%. And it turns out that was a much wiser decision than I ever could have known, because it was late at night. And next thing I know, we're on the way home, and just making radio calls is difficult. And you're screwing up simple conversations with ATC that under a normal day wouldn't be an issue. You kind of hit that mental alert button of, so this is what everybody's warned you about. And in my case, luckily, again, we made the wise choice of having the more fresh pilot fly, but we had that luxury. There were two of us.
Brought up a really important point, John, and thank you so much for sharing that little story again, because one of the research articles I was reading pointed out that very often what happens is that people who have this short-term sleep restriction very often don't realize that they're becoming sleep deprived. It's like one of the symptoms of it is that you lose the ability to self-reflect. So in a single pilot environment, this is really crucial to have people around you, even though you're a single pilot, especially if you're that newly minted, private pilot, and you're going off there and you've got 300 hours or so. I would like to keep lots of people around me, so I have that feeling and vibe that the professional crews are having around them of those checks and balances, and also keep up my own training so that those memory items are deeply embedded and have turned into wisdom that I can draw on, but they're not surface level memory. So this is all very human, right? All this stuff that we're going through, it's not to say a negative. It's just one aspect of what we deal with in aviation. And that's why I so love that we're having this conversation. Last little bit of research, and then we're going to turn on to like the strategies, because that's like so exciting to me of how to take this information and turn it into action. Little last piece, which was just on sleep restriction and how it is the same as sleep deprivation. We tend to think of, oh, you only got 2 hours or you pulled an all-nighter. Well, of course it's going to be bad. But that long-term sleep restriction, only getting 4 hours of sleep a night, or maybe you're getting 6 hours, but it's constantly being interrupted, or you're dealing with insomnia. So multiple studies have been done to determine the effects of total sleep deprivation. And so the effects of sleep restriction, which is more common, have the same effects as total sleep deprivation. Our bodies need to cycle through all those levels of REM sleep, the rapid eye movement sleep, so that the brain can remove the toxins that have built up and consolidate the memories that have occurred. So if we have this long-term chronic sleep restriction, the way it manifests is that we start to lose the ability to, quote, handle situations that require creative solutions to problems that are complex or lacking in sufficient information. Also, we are challenged to analyze unfamiliar environmental challenges. which makes me think of aviation. Like everything we do is complex and we very often don't have sufficient information. So let's turn to solutions, shall we? Yay. So I love Dr. Walker's thing, like 3.6 million years of evolution. Think of all of the replications and all the humans in your own lineage that came before you. That to me, and as the daughter of organic chemists, I'm like, ooh, that's a huge biological advantage. Like we have been programmed by nature and natural selection to be naturally healthy, to be naturally balanced, to be naturally happy, quite honestly, because we've been programmed to get this amount of sleep. And the research bears out that if we just follow that biology, good things happen. But to look at that, like, okay, it's not realistic. I'm not going to get 8 hours. I have an infant or, I have a 7 on, 7 off work schedule or whatever your unique challenge is. The question isn't necessarily like all or nothing. Get 8 hours of sleep every night for the rest of your life or you're doomed. But it's more, can you shift what you're doing to support your natural biology? And if you just do that, you're tipping the scales back in your favor. So for me, we use this concept in yoga all the time of adding good stuff in. And before I tell you what good stuff to add in, I have to tell you, so this Dr. Walker, who I'm clearly a fangirl of, like in one of his lectures, you guys, I almost like left out of my seat because he goes, falling asleep is not like a light switch. It's more like landing an airplane. He said it's done in stages. And when you follow the appropriate stages that your biology recognizes and you gradually step down your energy, just like we do in landing, that then the body naturally falls asleep. And all those biological processes that we want to have happen just begin to happen of their own accord. And this made me so happy that he said that. I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what it's like. So where to start? Start adding in habits that support the natural rhythm of your body. Again, avoid that all or nothing thinking that either get the 8 hours or just might as well stay up even later and have another cupcake. Forget it. Like just seeking those small things. And here's the psychology too of why adding in small things that feel good to you work. As human beings, along with this evolution to need that 8 hours of sleep, we're also wired to seek comfort. We're wired to seek safety. And we're wired to seek pleasure because our human organism as a biological creature knows that those things will keep us alive. So when we choose positive habits rather than punitive, wagging your finger, go to bed now and turn out the light and just lay there and be miserable, but instead we choose things that feel really good to us in the evening or at bedtime, our brain starts to naturally scan the environment for those things and starts to crave those. And gradually over time, instead of like willpowering yourself out of a staying up and binging Netflix habit, over time, the brain starts to scan and look for those things that are actually producing that comfort, safety, and pleasure, and starts to naturally shift you towards choosing those and dropping the Netflix habit gradually without that willpower. Concrete strategy number 1, and then I want to hear what you think about concrete strategy number 1. Strategy number 1 for improving your overall sleep restriction lifestyle would be to start tracking your sleep. But before you start tracking, there needs to be a decision made about what you actually want from your life, and then picking a sleep kind of parameter or like window that's going to work for you. So, example, for me, I have spent a lot of time thinking about who am I, how do I want to show up in the world, and how can I be useful? I know that for me, my life's mission is to deeply investigate myself, my mind, my body, and yes, my spiritual life, and take everything that I learn and share it through writing and teaching yoga and music. And apparently now doing a podcast too. But that's like one of my things is like to learn as much as I can about myself, is this microcosm of the universe, and then share what I learn with other people. Like that's my juice. And how I want to show up is usually pretty like joyful and relaxed. That's pretty much it. When I have that as a goal, for me, then my sleep parameter becomes very clear because I know that I prioritize meditating in the morning because that meditation in the morning helps me share what I learn with other people. And it's also part of investigating myself. So for me, then my sleep parameter becomes very easy to decide that I like to go to bed around 9:15, plus or minus half an hour. And I like to get up around 5, plus or minus half an hour. So I wrote that down on a sheet, my goal, how I want to show up, and then I write down my little sleep parameter. And every day I write down, did I do it? Yes or no? That's it. It's a yes or a no. I don't bother like with times to make it complicated. At the end of a month, I look back and I just calculate a percentage. About 80% of the time, I'm within that parameter. If I feel like I want to shift, I shift it. If I'm good with the 80%, I'm like, yeah, cool, close enough. But it helps me to actually be real with what I'm doing and not just kind of pretend that I'm getting enough or not getting enough. And sometimes it's shocking how far off I go on that. The smartphone is a real thing, you know? I don't know. What do you think about tracking sleep? Is that something that sounds like punitive or useful?
I think that it's a tough thing if you are in a profession where your schedule changes, because I think that in a lot of cases, obliging to a schedule of that nature becomes difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah.
And so I think some people out there would be saying, okay, well, I can do that for the days that I'm not obligated to do something else.
Exactly.
But then am I now ending up in a position where I feel worse about myself because, 7 out of 10 days I had a schedule that wouldn't let me do it. And so I had to go into the thing and say, nope, didn't do it. And my percentage goes down and now I'm disappointed.
I didn't get 100% on the quiz. That's where I love this idea about setting, instead of this all or nothing approach of I have to do it all the days, otherwise I suck, but actually setting parameters for yourself that work. So for example, I have a student who was working third shift as a nurse. She also has 6 children and is a single mom. Pause for effect. My head just wants to explode. And was working third shift, and she did that for 2 years. And she did not have a lot of control over her schedule either. It was she was a new nurse, right? So it was you get what you get and you don't get upset. So the way she handled it is she had a sliding set of parameters. She had general guidelines. She had the ones for the days that she knew she had sort of control over her schedule. And even that with the kids, she gave herself a 2-hour window of when she might go to sleep and when she might wake up. But the idea is that she was setting it ahead of time, saying, this is what I want. And the days when she had to work, she said, part of my parameter and my tracking is that on those days, I'm just going to track what actually happens and observe later and see what I can learn from it. So her tracking then didn't become, I'm setting an unrealistic goal. It became, let me just track and actually just observe what's actually happening on those days so I have more information. And then from there, she was able just to kind of use it to her advantage. So again, the resistance is usually this all or nothing thinking that you're going to set some goal and meet it, rather than who do I want to be and what is a supportive way that I can change how I'm tracking and managing that. So I don't know. Some people love tracking. Some of my students refuse. They will never track ever. It makes them just feel like they want to fight me. I'm like, well, then don't do it. Because if it's creating more stress, it's kind of the opposite of working with your biology. So take it.
Now, if you are a person who likes goals, as I think so often us pilots are,
asking for a friend, I'm the same way.
Is it as effective to be able to say, okay, under normal circumstances, this is the time I want to rest, and then on those circumstances where I can't, let's say I have a flight that takes me until 1 a.m. Is it as effective to say, an hour after I get home, I'm going to go to bed, whenever that time period might be, 2 hours, hour and a half, whatever works for you, depending on, what kind of personal things you've got to take care of when you get done with your work environment? Is that the same thing?
Taking personal responsibility for us means deciding what we want out of our life. What do we actually want? For everyone, it's something different. And once we decide what we actually want, and it can even be how you want to show up, then this is very counterintuitive, but roll with me. Like I said before, choosing what feels good with regards to sleep will have more influence on your behavior than what feels either punitive or feels like yet another goal that you have to achieve. It's this concept of undoing. Because again, if you have these millions of years of biology that is asking you to follow it and follow this natural process of down-regulating your energy in the evening and sleeping, what that biology is craving is what actually feels good and nourishing to you. And so setting yet another goal and saying, okay, 2 hours after I get home, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z is really different than saying, when I get home, I have this menu of like 7 things that I know I love to do that feel really good. And one of them might be scrolling for half an hour. It might be, but just putting a timer on that. Like that actually might feel really good to scroll and be on Facebook and do that, but just timing it. And then you have your other menu of options. So let me give some very specific daytime strategies, like really nitty gritty, like what we know from the research, because that's kind of meta and that works for some people and not for others. Sometimes it's like, just give me something concrete. So daytime strategy for better sleep. Get sunlight in your eyes in the morning. It has an effect on the back of the retina, and it sets off this cascade of change in your biology that actually sets the stage for sleep later in the day and also increases wakefulness during the day. Won't go into all the biological pathways, but they exist. And this actually, interestingly enough, I have a number of students who do not have sight or very limited vision. And the studies show that even in that, getting light to the back of their retina and the back of the brainstem has the same effect. So it's like a biological need that we have to get that daylight in our eyes. What a beautiful excuse to go outside in the morning and take a bit of exercise, which is another strategy, a daytime strategy to improving your nighttime sleep. If possible, exercise in the morning. If not, we know that exercise at any time during the day does wonders for your sleep, but there's something about the rhythm of the body, of the heating and the cooling it goes through, that exercising in the morning really helps. My last fangirl for our sleep doctor, I want to call him Dr. Matt, Dr. Matthew Walker, he actually talked about in one of his lectures that he used to think that, what did he say, meditation was kind of out there. To which I'm like, dude, you're a neuroscientist. You're studying the brain. And the way that we have to study the brain is sitting in meditation, observing it. And even he thought it was out there. But he started meditating every night, and he noticed that his sleep improved. So why this works is because it starts to train the brain to move from that alert, active system, what they call the sympathetic nervous system, when you're really active and engaged. And it shifts your biochemistry to using the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of your nervous system responsible for resting and digesting too, which is important, information and food. So when we meditate regularly, it's like this superpower where we can, if you're looking for that light switch, it kind of is that light switch if you do it long enough, where you can go into a more quiet state for body and mind, and it's deeply restorative. Another daytime strategy is to communicate with whoever you sleep with what you need. Oh, I don't necessarily want to open the Pandora's box here, but sleeping with animals, sleeping with someone who snores, sleeping with, like my student does, with her 6 kids piled on top of her, that can be challenging. You know, my dad had restless leg syndrome, so my mom and dad finally got separate beds in the same bedroom. My mom's like, I'm tired of being kicked all night long.
Oof.
I'm not sleeping well. Separate beds, same bedroom. I have a separate bedroom than my husband does. We have different schedules. It works for us because I like to sleep, clearly. So that's daytime strategies. All right, let's talk about evening strategies, then we'll go to bedtime. So evening strategies, pretty quick here. Eat dinner a little bit earlier than maybe you normally would. It's kind of like going to bed and you've already done a good bit of your digestion. So eating dinner very close to bedtime is really, really disruptive because your system is working on overdrive to kind of accommodate all of this food. And it can lead to, even if you feel like you sleep well, it can lead to a more disrupted sleep because your body is doing processes that it wishes it had done when you were awake. So you're neither really full nor really empty, you know, but sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you're ravenous when you land at a new place. You just need to eat. So Again, adjust, accommodate, adapt. None of this is hard and fast. It's all to kind of take and go, how can I make that work for me? Here's a key one that I found really, really helpful. About an hour before, whenever it is you need to go to bed, start dimming the lights and get the lights to about half of what you would normally be used to. Your body really has evolved to respond to cues from the natural world of light and dark. If you dim the lights by half, it never ceases to amaze me how sleepy I start to get, even if I'm coming in off a concert or a recital and I am like wired and like on a high. I get in that dim room, and by the time like I've changed my PJs and washed my face, I'm like, wow, I almost feel kind of zonked a little bit. The body will respond to that, and the mind eventually will catch up. All right, you ready for some bedtime strategies?
Lay 'em on me.
Okay. Use technology. Don't let it use you. We're going to have our phones in our bedrooms, aren't we? I mean, I do. I mean, right? Sometimes people are like, get the phone out of the bedroom. Well, like, what if it's your alarm clock? Or what if you're in a hotel room? You know, like, it's not realistic. So what I generally do, not always successfully, but I try to, once I'm in the bedroom, if I want to use social media, or I remember I'm out of face cream and I want to order it while I'm thinking of it, I just set a timer. I'm like, yeah, you can use the internet, woman. Don't be so restrictive and like grinding against this. I just set a timer. Go and do all of your things on your phone and tippity tap away. But after 20 minutes, you're done. I treat myself like a child because my brain is like that when I go on my phone. I will get sucked in, and 2 hours later, I'm like, my brain is melting. So that's one rule I have for my smartphone is I just use a timer. The other one is once I hit that certain point where I'm in bed, I can use it to listen to an uplifting audiobook or a guided relaxation or meditation only. And that's it. I can still use it, but I'm listening and using things that I find help me sleep. Do you use a smartphone in your bedroom? Do you have any parameters around it? Or do you just kind of react to it, fall into the reaction trap and just react to it? It's so easy for that to happen.
Yeah, as anybody who's listened to this podcast will tell you, my main reaction to most of this is I'm a prime example of all the things you're not supposed to do. No, I don't have any restrictions. It is a serious issue because I will fall down a social media hole, and next thing I know, I'm an hour and a half into just wondering what Punxsutawney Phil saw the other day, and
yes.
I wonder, well, how long have we been doing this? And wait, groundhogs eat this, and they've been around. They're evolved from another ant. Like, next thing I know, it's 1 a.m, and all I've been looking at is the ancient history of groundhogs. So, I'm not a very good example, but I think that also, in and of itself, leads to prime material for what we are doing, because I think one of the things that we've talked about previously, and I'm sort of springing this on you now as part of the episode, but we'll get into it later, is, I'm a great person to test all of these things on because I truthfully haven't done any of them, and the things that I have figured out have been through desperation. So there may be a whole episode on giving me homework or giving me things to try and seeing how well that works. I do have a friend who used to be for a regional. Actually, I think he flies for a major now, which is great because he's a former student of mine. It's funny how that happened.
Cool.
About a year ago or so, he had went out and bought one of those blue light filters because he realized that his personal weakness was, I can't pull myself away from my phone. But as so often we do in society, instead of quitting a vice, we just come up with something that makes the vice acceptable. And so he bought these blue light glasses, and I never actually had a chance to find out whether they worked for him, but that might be a prime thing for me to try.
Absolutely. Report back later, will you? I love this idea. Yes, I think I see a part 2 to this where you're given some homework, or actually you won't be given homework. The whole point of homework is that you're going to choose for yourself what feels good, because that starts to reprogram your brain to seek out nourishing things rather things than deplete you. But we'll guide you through that process maybe of picking some things and then see what happens, because it's all information. I love that idea. Just don't blame the teacher if none of it works. So what else works? Okay, we talked about dim lights. We talked about use technology. Don't let it use you. A very simple thing you can do is to use guided relaxations and or relaxing music. Relaxing music, this is me putting my music therapist hat on. So relaxing music, which we actually would call in the therapy tradition sedative music, has a slow beat, which is about what a second hand ticks, about 60 beats per minute. So it's about boom, boom, slow. It generally has like the same instrumentation. So it's like all instruments of the same family. And there's no sudden movements, right? It doesn't get suddenly loud or suddenly soft. It stays in the same dynamic range. When we listen to a piece of music like that over the course of 5 or 10 minutes, our body does something called entrainment. Our body naturally matches the rhythms inherent in the music. We don't have to think about it. It happens by a process they call the thalamic reflex. Who cares? All that matters is that your body just bypasses the thinking part of your brain and produces an immediate physical response, which is to match the music. It's kind of like why if your favorite tune comes on, you might just start like nodding your head or tapping your foot. You don't even necessarily think that you're doing that. It just happens naturally. We all have this reflex. You'll see it even in babies and kids. It's really cool. But we can use this to our advantage by putting on our preferred music that has these qualities I described: slow tempo, instruments of the same family, no sudden movements in tempo or rhythm, without you needing to think about it or do anything special. Your heart rate will slow down, your breathing rate will then follow in turn, and the blood pressure generally decreases as well. And then the cortisol stress hormones start to downregulate as well. And your body shifts, just like we say that plane coming into land, slowly sheds that energy of the day and starts to match the pace of the music. It's a really nice way just to downshift. Whether you end up falling asleep or not, at least you've moved to a more restful state. Isn't that nice? That's why we sing lullabies to kids. We're no different just because we're bigger. And I don't know about smarter, but we think we are. Another favorite thing, and I'll link to all my favorites, are guided relaxations. There are so many. Just type in guided relaxation for sleep into Google and see what happens. Find a person's whose voice you love. There's all different kinds of ones. They're so amazing, but why these work is because there's so many different strategies to employ the more analytical mind, the people who are more visual, folks who are more goal-oriented. There's a guided relaxation for every type of personality out there, which will take your nervous system arousal from that state of being sort of hyper-responsive and reactive, and then into that parasympathetic nervous state where your body is primed to rest and relax. So I think we're going to do a couple bonus episodes with me doing 2 of these, right?
I think so. Yeah. And I think that, this is where my personal favorite of sleep stories comes in too. It's not so much a guided relaxation per se, but man, I can't last more than about 10 minutes of Bob Ross before I fall asleep.
It's perfect.
Those happy little trees just make me fall right to sleep. So yes, I can absolutely say I've done the research on that already, and it works.
It works. They absolutely do. And that's why I love having tech in the bedroom for this purpose, because everyone is going to find one that they like. And I have many different ones for many different occasions. And the ones that I'm going to share on the bonus recordings are ones that once you learn the technique, you can easily do for yourself. And I frequently do these when I find myself waking up in the middle of the night and I can't fall back asleep. I'll just sort of take myself through the beginning of one of these, and then next thing I know, it's, the birds are singing outside. So what else? We have entrainment with music. We have guided relaxation and sleep stories to get that parasympathetic nervous response going there. That we've got dim lights. We have positively tracking your sleep or not. One last little thing. Did I say meditation? I think I mentioned meditation earlier. I personally don't love to meditate before bed because I'm too tired, but I love to do a little gentle yoga before bed. It doesn't have to be quote unquote yoga. It can be moving, stretching, Sometimes we think that we have to solve all of these problems through our mind, and we forget that the biological organism of our body, the pathway works both out and in. So think about if you put your hand on a hot stove, your body's going to retract that hand without even thinking about it. The body has all this intelligence that it's constantly sending and feeding to our cognitive intelligence, our brain. And there are certain positions that we can do, particularly I'm thinking now yoga, because that's my area of expertise, but where we lengthen the muscles along the spine and then place them in a forward bending motion. So think like a simple just bending forward, or if you know yoga, child's pose. Doesn't matter if you know it or not. But when we elongate the muscles along the spine and put them in a forward position, it's been shown that this triggers the parasympathetic nervous system to turn on. And your mind can be, and I've experienced this, my mind is going and resisting and I go into these yoga poses and hold it for a minute or two and just breathe and kind of hang out there. I come up from it and I'm like, I feel different. And what is amazing is to teach a class of high schoolers these poses, and they come in there wired and misbehaving and all over the place. By the time we get to the end of a yoga class, and then we do some of these forward bending poses or twists, do the same thing, they come out of the poses, they all look half asleep. At that point, I say, turn around on your mat, lay down. I'm going to lead you through a guided meditation, but laying down on the floor. And within a couple of minutes, you hear, like half the students are snoring and asleep. Last little strategy is breath work, which I'm not going to get super into today, but there are a number of, they even have it on different apps now where they have those little balloons, right? It tells you to breathe in for 4, hold for 4, and then breathe out for 4, and they'll guide you right through it. It's different for everybody what breathing strategy works, but lengthening your exhale, again, triggers a parasympathetic nervous response. It also triggers the vagus nerve, which is a nerve that connects your brain down to your gut that helps with emotional regulation and sleep inducement. So deep breathing, patterned sequence breathing is also very helpful as well. So lots to explore with that.
But does counting sheep work?
No. Oh my gosh. It doesn't. There was one of the studies I found when I was like in my like little research hive. You should have seen me. I was like, I had all these articles everywhere. It was amazing. They actually did a study on that and it doesn't work. At least this one study. They said it doesn't, it has the opposite effect. It was more stimulating and those people had a harder time going to sleep. So let that one go.
I was debating whether to ask that question, and now I'm glad that I did because
we actually have research proof that it doesn't work. Go to sleep, go to sleep. It's so funny. I was doing all this research, and then those nights I had the worst sleep ever because my brain was like, sleep, 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 sleep. And then I kept waking up every 2 hours with more ideas about how to get better sleep. This is really funny. That's just the way the brain works. And I think that's, if I have one takeaway for people, is just to say, this is a natural biological process. And sometimes it's great. And other times it's not. Sometimes you're going to get all of it, and sometimes you're going to get none of it. Find ways that you can shift and use what you know is your natural biological rhythm to get that 8 hours. What are easy and pleasurable things that you can do to shift yourself towards getting more rest before sleep and then maximizing the sleep that you have? But just think about shifting towards your biology. Let go of that all or nothing and let it be what it's going to be, because we've evolved. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Well, and I think that one of the big takeaways for me that you said was that sometimes preparing for sleep and rest, although again, rest is a different discussion, is what you do in the morning. It's not always what you do in the evening. And I think that that's a really, really important point, because nobody thinks about the beginning of the day as prep for the end of the day, when in reality, if you want to sleep when the day's over, you have to lay those building blocks from the moment that you wake up.
Yes, I think that's a really, really good point. We didn't even talk about caffeine and alcohol. But short story is that alcohol isn't super great for sleep, because you will sleep, but your sleep is more disrupted. And man, they said to stop caffeine 10 hours before bed. I'm like, womp womp. I don't do that. Maybe that'll be my homework. Stop caffeine 10 hours before bed. I'm like, they don't want to do that. Please, we want you to be part of the conversation. We want to hear from you. Really, we mean that. Send us an email at calmcockpit@gmail.com. Or is it calmcockpitpodcast@gmail?
Calmcockpit@gmail.com.
Thank you. Or drop us a comment on our website. On our website homepage, there's a form right there. You can leave a comment right there at calmcockpit.com. We really do want to hear from you. And for future episodes, what are the challenges you face with sleeping? Or what have you figured out? Please share with us because we really want to continue the conversation in ways that are helpful for you guys. So please do reach out anytime.
What can we test on ourselves? If you've got ideas within reason, because I am not going to violate any laws and I'm not going to violate my medical. But if you found that, carrying something around helps you sleep at night, even though I will probably think it's completely bogus, I'm willing to try it just for the sake of the podcast. So let's get some ideas. What do you guys do to go to sleep?
Absolutely love it. So I think that's a wrap on our sleep episode. What do you think? Did we cover it all?
Oh, not even close.
Not even close. We did as much as we could for this one episode.
That's right.
So
That's
please, everybody, like I said, reach out, give us some comments, some suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. Also follow us on social media, Facebook and Instagram. We got a nice little following on Facebook over there. You guys, awesome. And you can also find us on YouTube. Always subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And what else?
That's all I got for you.
All right.
Fly smarter.
And stress less. And sleep well.
Air 1 departure is Airbus 321. Traffic holding crossing runway 33 left, 3 lane.